You want to know what real power looks like when it collapses? It's not a scream. It's not a war. It's one woman turning her back and walking away, and the most dangerous man in England realizing he can't stop her. What happens when control becomes obsession, when fear disguises itself as strength, and when the one thing a man thought he owned decides she was never his to keep? Stay with me through this, because what starts as rejection becomes something far darker, and by the end, you'll understand why some men don't break until they've already lost everything. The ballroom fell silent in sections. First the musicians, violins dying mid-note as if someone had cut their strings. Then the dancers, their feet stumbling to stillness on the marble floor. Finally the aristocrats themselves, champagne glasses freezing halfway to painted lips, conversation withering in their throats. Lady Vivian Ashford stood in the center of it all, her hand no longer resting in Duke Adrian Blackthorne's palm. She had pulled it back, slowly, deliberately, the way you'd withdraw from a flame before it burned you beyond recognition. Adrian didn't move. He stood there beneath the chandeliers of Ashford Manor, his expression carved from the same stone as the family crest above the doorway. His jaw was set. His eyes were dark. And for a man who had spent 34 years perfecting the art of intimidation, the fact that he said nothing at all was the most terrifying response he could have given. Vivian's father, Lord Reginald Ashford, stepped forward from the edge of the crowd, his face the color of spoiled wine. "Vivian, this is final." Her voice cut through the room like glass breaking underfoot. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. "I will not marry the Duke of Blackthorne." The room erupted into whispers, a swarm of locusts descending on a field. Women leaned into each other, fans snapping open to hide their delighted shock. Men exchanged glances, calculating what this meant for alliances, for business, for survival in a world where Adrian Blackthorne's favor could make or destroy a family overnight. Adrian still hadn't spoken. He stood with his hands at his sides, shoulders squared, watching Vivian the way a predator watches prey that has inexplicably stopped running. There was no anger in his face, no humiliation, just a kind of cold, focused attention that made the air around him feel thinner. Vivian met his gaze and held it. She'd been doing that for 3 months, since the engagement was announced, since her father had sold her future to secure a business partnership, since she'd realized that marrying Adrian Blackthorne would mean disappearing into the shadow of a man who treated people like chess pieces and power like oxygen. "You're making a mistake," her father hissed, grabbing her elbow. His fingers dug in hard enough to bruise. "Do you understand what you're throwing away? The Duke is—" "Right here," Adrian said quietly. Lord Ashford's hand dropped from Vivian's arm as if he'd been burned. He took 2 steps back, his face draining to the color of old parchment. Around them, the whispers died again. When Adrian Blackthorne spoke, even the architecture seemed to lean in and listen. Adrian looked at Vivian. Just looked. His eyes were the color of smoke over deep water, gray and impossible to read. He was handsome in the way a wolf is handsome, all sharp lines and controlled violence. His tailored black jacket fit him like armor. His cravat was perfect. Everything about him screamed discipline, control, dominance. "Is this truly what you want?" he asked. His voice was low, almost gentle. It was the tone you'd use with someone standing on the edge of a cliff. Vivian's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her chin up. "Yes." "You're certain?" "I am." He nodded once, slowly. Then he turned to face the crowd. Every eye in the ballroom was on him. Lord Pemberton with his calculating smirk, Lady Worthington with her hand pressed to her chest in theatrical horror, the younger lords who'd spent years trying to curry Adrian's favor and failing. They were all waiting to see what the Duke of Blackthorne would do when publicly humiliated by a woman half his age. Adrian smiled. It was a terrible thing to witness. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the room, "it appears my engagement has come to an unexpected end. I'm sure you'll all have fascinating conversations about it for weeks to come. Please, don't let this disrupt your evening." He bowed, a shallow, mocking gesture, and walked toward the exit. The crowd parted for him the way the sea parts for a storm. No one spoke. No one moved. They just watched as the most powerful man in England left the ballroom without a backward glance, his boots clicking against marble in perfect measured rhythm. Vivienne stood alone in the center of the floor, her hands shaking so badly she had to clasp them together. Her father's face had gone from pale to purple. Her mother was crying somewhere in the crowd, and all around her the aristocracy was already beginning to tear her apart. "Foolish girl," someone muttered. "She'll regret this," another voice agreed. "The Duke will destroy her family." Vivienne turned and walked in the opposite direction Adrian had gone, toward the terrace doors. Her legs felt like water. Her lungs felt like they'd forgotten how to work. But she kept moving, kept her spine straight, kept her face composed until she was outside in the cold October air, alone beneath the stars. Only then did she let herself breathe. 3 days later, Adrian sat in his study at Blackthorn Hall, staring at the letter on his desk. He hadn't opened it. He didn't need to. The seal told him everything, the Ashford family crest pressed into red wax that had probably been melted by Lord Reginald's shaking hands. "Your Grace," his steward Graves said from the doorway. "The messenger is waiting for a response." Adrian picked up the letter and held it over the candle flame. The wax bubbled and blackened. The paper caught fire, curling in on itself until there was nothing left but ash. "Tell him there is no response," Adrian said. Graves hesitated. "Your Grace, if I may, the rumors in London are escalating. Perhaps a public statement might—" "Graves." The steward fell silent. Adrian stood and walked to the window. Blackthorn Hall stretched out before him, 300 acres of manicured gardens, forests, and power consolidated over 8 generations. From here, he could see the tenant cottages, the stables, the chapel where his ancestors were buried beneath marble so white it hurt to look at in sunlight. He'd been raised in this house, taught to lead in these rooms. His father had died in the chair Adrian now sat in, after spending 40 years teaching his son one fundamental truth. Power is the only thing that matters. Love is weakness. Sentiment is suicide. A blackthorn does not bend, does not break, does not allow anyone to see the cracks beneath the surface. Adrian had learned the lesson well. By the time he was 20, he'd consolidated political alliances across England. By 25, he controlled shipping routes, coal mines, and enough parliamentary votes to make or break legislation. By 30, even the king listened when Adrian spoke. And then Vivienne Ashford had looked at him across a ballroom and said no. "Your Grace?" Graves ventured quietly. Adrian didn't turn around. "Have someone watch her." "I'm sorry?" "Lady Vivienne. I want to know where she goes, who she speaks to, what she does." Adrian's voice was perfectly calm, perfectly controlled. "Discreetly." Graves shifted his weight. "Your Grace, with respect, if you're concerned about her safety, perhaps—" "I'm not concerned about her safety." Adrian's reflection stared back at him from the dark window glass. "I'm concerned about what she might say, what she might do. She walked away from this engagement publicly. That makes her dangerous." It was a lie. He knew it was a lie even as the words left his mouth. But the truth was something Adrian couldn't afford to acknowledge, not even to himself. The truth was that Vivienne Ashford had done something no one else had ever managed. She'd walked away from him, and instead of feeling relieved or indifferent, Adrian had spent 3 days unable to think about anything else. He kept seeing her face in that ballroom, the way she'd pulled her hand back, the steadiness in her voice when she'd said, "I will not marry the Duke of Blackthorn." Most people couldn't hold his gaze for more than a few seconds. Vivienne had looked at him like she was staring down an equal. It was infuriating, it was fascinating, and it was terrifying in a way Adrian didn't have words for. "Find out where she's going," he said again, "and report back to me weekly." "Yes, Your Grace." Graves bowed and left. Adrian stayed at the window long after the steward's footsteps faded. Outside, the sun was setting over Blackthorn lands, painting everything in shades of blood and gold. He pressed his palm against the cold glass and wondered distantly when he'd become the kind of man who needed to watch someone from the shadows just to feel like he still had control. Vivienne left London on a grey morning in late October when the fog was thick enough to hide her departure from prying eyes. She took one trunk, 40 pounds, and a letter of introduction from an old friend of her mother's. She didn't tell her father where she was going. She didn't tell anyone. The coach ride to the coast took 2 days. Vivienne spent most of it staring out the window, watching the landscape change from London's smoke-stained streets to rolling fields, and finally to the wild, windswept cliffs of the southeastern shore. By the time she arrived in the village of Ashcroft-on-Sea, her entire body ached and her mind felt scraped raw. The estate she'd come to work at sat at the edge of the village, a sprawling manor house that had probably been grand 50 years ago and was now slowly surrendering to time and neglect. The stone walls were dark with moisture. The gardens were overgrown. Seabirds nested in the eaves, their cries echoing across the empty courtyards. Mrs. Eleanor Greaves, the widow who owned the property, met Vivian at the door. She was 70, if she was a day, with white hair pulled into a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. "You're Lord Ashford's daughter," she said. It wasn't a question. "I was," Vivian replied. Mrs. Greaves studied her for a long moment, then nodded and stepped aside. "Come in. You look half dead." The interior of the house was in better condition than Vivian had expected. Old furniture, but well-maintained, faded rugs, but clean, windows that rattled in their frames, but still kept out the wind. Mrs. Greaves led her through a series of hallways to a small bedroom on the second floor. "This was my daughter's room," the old woman said. "She died 20 years ago, married a sailor who took her to India. Fever got her before she turned 30. She ran her hand along the doorframe. You'll sleep here. Meals are at 8, 1, and 7. I expect you to earn your keep. There's work enough around this place to keep 10 people busy." "Thank you," Vivian said quietly. Mrs. Greaves turned to leave, then paused. "They'll come looking for you eventually. Men like your father don't let their daughters disappear without a fight." "I know. And the Duke?" Vivian's hands tightened on the handle of her trunk. "What about him? Will he come looking too?" "No." Vivian's voice was steady. "The Duke doesn't chase. He waits for people to come back." Mrs. Greaves smiled, thin and knowing. "Then I suppose we'll see how long you can stay away." Adrian received the first report 2 weeks later. He was in the library at Blackthorn Hall, reviewing contracts for a shipping investment, when Graves entered and placed a sealed envelope on the desk. Adrian didn't open it immediately. He finished reading the paragraph he was on, signed his name at the bottom of the contract, and only then picked up the envelope. Inside was a single page written in clean, efficient script. Subject has relocated to Ashcroft-on-Sea. Currently employed as companion to Mrs. Eleanor Greaves at Greaves Estate. No contact with family, no correspondence sent or received. Subject appears in good health and stable circumstances. Adrian read it 3 times. Then he folded the paper carefully and placed it in his desk drawer, beneath the contracts and ledgers, and all the other pieces of his carefully controlled empire. Ashcroft-on-Sea. He knew the area, a minor shipping port, economically depressed, the kind of place where families had been losing land for generations because they couldn't compete with the industrial consolidation happening across England. Not the sort of place a woman like Vivian Ashford would normally choose, which meant she was running, not just from her family, from him. Adrian leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. The smart thing to do was let her go. She'd made her position clear. The engagement was over. He'd already declined Lord Ashford's increasingly desperate attempts to negotiate a reconciliation. There was no strategic advantage in pursuing this further. And yet, he kept thinking about the way she'd looked at him in that ballroom. Not with fear, not even with anger, just clarity. Like she'd seen through every mask he wore and decided that what lay beneath wasn't worth staying for. It should have been a relief. It should have proved his father right. Sentiment is weakness. Attachment is vulnerability. Letting someone get close enough to see you clearly is the fastest way to get destroyed. Instead, Adrian felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Something that sat in his chest like a stone and made it difficult to focus on anything else. He told himself it was wounded pride. He told himself it was strategic concern. A woman scorned could cause political damage. He told himself 100 different lies, all of them more acceptable than the truth. The truth was that Vivian Ashford had become the only person in Adrian's entire life who'd ever made him feel like maybe, possibly, he was something more than the sum of his power and his title and his perfectly controlled reputation. And she'd walked away anyway. "Your Grace?" Graves appeared in the doorway again, hesitant. "Lord Pemberton is here to see you. He says it's urgent." Adrian closed the desk drawer and stood. "Send him in." Lord Pemberton entered a moment later, all nervous energy and sweating palms despite the autumn chill. He was 43, overweight, and deeply in debt to 3 different banks, all information Adrian had committed to memory years ago, because knowing what people owed was even more useful than knowing what they owned. Your Grace. Pemberton bowed so low his spine must have creaked. Thank you for seeing me on short notice. You have 5 minutes, Adrian said. Use them wisely. Pemberton swallowed hard. It's about the Ashford girl, Lady Vivian. I've heard she's relocated to the coast. Ashcroft-on-Sea specifically. Adrian's expression didn't change. And I thought you should know there's been talk about the land situation down there. Several noble families have been consolidating properties, buying out tenant farmers who can't pay their rents. Perfectly legal, of course, but Pemberton's eyes darted to the side. There's been resistance. Complaints filed with magistrates. Some of the locals are claiming coercion, fraud, that sort of thing. What does this have to do with Lady Vivian? Well, Pemberton licked his lips. The Greaves estate she's staying at. It's right in the middle of the disputed territory. Mrs. Greaves has refused to sell for years. If the girl starts asking questions, starts stirring up trouble with the tenants, he trailed off meaningfully. Adrian walked to the window and looked out at his perfectly maintained grounds. You're involved in this consolidation scheme. It wasn't a question. Pemberton's face went white anyway. Your Grace, I assure you everything has been conducted within the bounds of... I don't care. Adrian turned back to face him. What I care about is why you're here, telling me this. What do you want? Pemberton drew himself up, trying to look dignified and failing. I thought perhaps you might be interested in ensuring Lady Vivian doesn't interfere. Given your history with the family, I could arrange for certain pressures to be applied. Nothing violent, of course, just economic incentives to encourage her to relocate somewhere less complicated. The room went very quiet. Adrian studied Pemberton the way an entomologist studies an insect pinned to a board, with detached clinical interest. Let me be clear, Adrian said softly. You came into my home to suggest I help you intimidate a woman into silence. Is that correct? Pemberton's Adam's apple bobbed. Your Grace, I only thought... You thought wrong. Adrian's voice dropped another degree. Lady Vivian's location and activities are no concern of yours. If I hear that you or any of your associates have approached her, threatened her, or made her life difficult in any way, I will personally ensure that every bank you owe money to calls in your debts simultaneously. Do you understand? Yes, Your Grace, of course. I apologize for any... Get out. Pemberton fled. Adrian heard his footsteps receding down the hallway, fast and panicked. When the front door slammed shut, the entire house seemed to exhale. Graves appeared in the doorway again, eyebrows raised. Your Grace? Send word to Ashcroft-on-Sea, Adrian said quietly. I want to know who's involved in this land consolidation scheme. Names, properties, methods, everything. And Lady Vivian? Don't let her know she's being watched. Adrian turned back to the window. But if anyone approaches her with threats or coercion, I want to know immediately. Yes, Your Grace. After Graves left, Adrian stood alone in the library for a long time, his reflection staring back at him from the dark glass. He told himself he was protecting his reputation. He told himself this was about maintaining control of a situation that could become politically complicated. He told himself everything except the truth, that the thought of Vivian in danger made something cold and terrible unfold in his chest, something that felt dangerously close to fear. And Duke Adrian Blackthorne had built an empire on the principle that fear was a weapon you used against others, never something you allowed yourself to feel. Until now. O Bambuk. 3 months later, Vivian would discover the documents that proved Lord Pemberton and his allies were stealing land through forged deeds and intimidation. And on a winter night when assassins came to Greaves' estate, Adrian Blackthorne would arrive just in time, not because he'd been informed, but because he'd been watching from the shadows all along, unable to stay away from the only woman who'd ever made him realize that some things are worse than losing power. Some things are worse than death. The worst thing of all is loving someone enough that losing them would destroy you, and knowing they might never come back. Vivian discovered the first irregularity on a Tuesday morning in late January, when the frost was thick enough to crack under her boots and the sea wind carried the smell of salt and rotting kelp. She'd been sorting through Mrs. Greaves's correspondence. 3 months of unpaid bills, tenant complaints, and increasingly aggressive letters from something called the Coastal Development Association. The old woman's eyesight was failing, her hands shook too much to write replies, and someone had to manage the mess before the estate collapsed entirely. That's when Vivian found the deed. It was tucked between 2 mundane property tax notices, written on expensive paper with an official seal she didn't recognize. The document claimed that a tenant farmer named Thomas Hewitt had voluntarily sold his 40 acres to Lord Pemberton for the sum of £50, a laughably low price for land that close to the coast. Vivian knew Thomas Hewitt. He was 63, illiterate, and so devoted to his land that he'd told her last week he'd rather die than leave it. She'd watched him cry when he talked about his grandchildren, about wanting them to inherit something worth keeping. She read the deed again. The signature at the bottom was shaky, uncertain. Nothing like the confident mark Thomas made when he signed for seed deliveries. Something cold settled in Vivian's stomach. She found Mrs. Greaves in the drawing room, sitting by the fire with a blanket over her knees and a cat sleeping in her lap. The old woman looked up when Vivian entered, her eyes cloudy but sharp. "You found something," Mrs. Greaves said. Not a question. Vivian held up the deed. "When did this arrive?" 2 weeks ago, maybe 3. They all blur together now. The old woman's mouth thinned. "That's the 4th one this month. Different families, different amounts, all the same company buying. The Coastal Development Association. Fancy name for thieves." Mrs. Greaves scratched the cat's ears. The animal purred, oblivious. "They've been at it for 2 years now. Started with the families furthest from the village, people who couldn't afford solicitors, couldn't read the contracts they were signing. By the time anyone realized what was happening, half the tenant farms were gone." Vivian sat down across from her. "And no one's fought back?" "Fought back with what?" The old woman's laugh was bitter. "These are people who survive on what they grow. They don't have money for legal battles. They don't have connections in London. Most of them can't even prove the sales were fraudulent because the paperwork looks legitimate." She paused. "Until you look closer. The signatures are forged. Some of them. Others were coerced. Sign or your rent goes up. Sign or we'll tell the magistrate you've been poaching. Sign or something unfortunate might happen to your daughter walking home at night." Mrs. Greaves's hands tightened on the blanket. "It's all very civilized, very legal, and it's destroying families that have worked this land for generations." Vivian stared at the deed in her hands. The seal gleamed in the firelight, official and damning. "Who's the magistrate here?" "Lord Hastings. Good man, but old. They've been working around him, filing documents when he's away in London, rushing through approvals before anyone can object." Mrs. Greaves leaned forward. "What are you thinking, girl?" "I'm thinking someone needs to make noise about this, publicly." Vivian looked up. "Loud enough that London hears it." The old woman studied her for a long moment. "You do that, they'll come after you. These aren't merchants playing at power. These are nobles with connections, money, and no conscience. Your father already disowned you for breaking your engagement. You make enemies of these people too. You'll have nowhere left to run." Vivian thought about the ballroom in London, about Adrian's face when she'd pulled her hand away, about 3 months of waking up in a room that wasn't hers, eating meals at someone else's table, pretending that freedom didn't sometimes feel exactly like exile. She'd walked away from everything once already. What was one more bridge burned? "Let them come," she said quietly. "I'm tired of watching people with power destroy people without it." Mrs. Greaves smiled then, sharp and knowing. "My daughter would have liked you." Adrian received the second report on a Thursday. He was in London attending a parliamentary session that bored him to the point of physical pain when Graves slipped a note into his hand during a recess. Adrian unfolded it beneath the cover of his desk. "Subject has begun investigating land fraud in Ashcroft-on-Sea. Has visited 3 displaced tenant families in past week. Spoke with local magistrate yesterday. Appears to be gathering evidence." Adrian read it twice, then burned the paper in the nearest candle before anyone could see. Around him, lords debated tariffs and trade agreements, their voices blending into meaningless noise. He wasn't listening anymore. Vivian was investigating, which meant she'd found something. which meant she was putting herself directly in the path of people who'd already proven they were willing to use violence to protect their profits. The smart thing to do was nothing. Let her make her stand. Let her learn that moral righteousness wasn't armor against men who viewed ethics as an obstacle to be overcome. She'd walked away from his protection. This was the consequence. Adrian stood abruptly and left the chamber. Behind him, someone called his name, Lord Whitmore probably, wanting to discuss some vote or alliance or piece of political theater that didn't matter. Adrian didn't stop. He walked through the corridors of Westminster until he found an empty office, locked the door, and stood there in the silence. His hands were shaking. He couldn't remember the last time his hands had shaken. He thought about Pemberton's visit 3 months ago, about the land consolidation scheme, about the way the man had suggested applying pressure to Vivian as if she were a problem to be solved through intimidation. Adrian had sent his own investigators to Ashcroft-on-Sea after that conversation. What they'd found was worse than simple fraud. The Coastal Development Association was a shell. Behind it sat 5 noble families, all deeply in debt, all desperate enough to steal from people who couldn't fight back. They'd been forging deeds, bribing clerks, threatening witnesses. And when threats didn't work, people started having accidents. A barn fire here, a fall from a horse there, a child who wandered too close to the cliffs and barely survived. Nothing provable, nothing that would stand up in court, just enough violence to keep people quiet and compliant. And Vivian had walked straight into the middle of it, armed with nothing but conviction and a complete lack of understanding about how dangerous cornered men could be. Adrian pressed his palms against the desk until the wood bit into his skin. He was thinking about her hands in that ballroom, pulling away from his. He was thinking about the way she'd looked at him, not with hatred, but with something worse, disappointment. Like she'd expected better and found exactly what she'd feared. He'd spent 3 months telling himself he didn't care, that her opinion of him was irrelevant, that he'd built his entire life on the principle that other people's judgment didn't matter as long as he maintained control. But standing in that empty office, hands shaking, Adrian had to acknowledge something he'd been avoiding since the moment Vivian walked away. He'd lied to himself about why he was having her watched. It wasn't about protecting his reputation. It wasn't about strategy or control or any of the rational justifications he'd constructed. It was because the thought of not knowing where she was, whether she was safe, whether she was thinking about him at all, that thought felt like drowning. And men like Adrian Blackthorne didn't drown. They didn't allow themselves to need anyone. They certainly didn't obsess over women who'd rejected them publicly and thoroughly, except here he was, obsessing. He unlocked the door and found Graves waiting in the hallway, patient and unreadable as always. "Your Grace?" "I'm going to Ashcroft-on-Sea," Adrian said. Graves didn't react. "When?" "Now. Have the carriage ready in 20 minutes. Your Grace, you have meetings scheduled for the next 3 days. Lord Whitmore specifically requested, cancel them." Adrian was already moving down the hallway, his mind working through logistics. "Send word ahead that I'll be arriving at the Anchor Inn, quietly. No announcements." "May I ask the reason for this sudden departure?" Adrian stopped walking. He turned to face his steward, and for just a moment he considered telling the truth. That he was going because Vivian was in danger. That he hadn't been able to think clearly for 3 months, that the idea of her facing those men alone made him feel something he hadn't felt since he was 8 years old, and his father had locked him in the cellar for crying, pure animal fear. Instead, he said, "I have business interests in the area. It's time I inspected them personally." Graves nodded, his expression revealing nothing. "Of course, Your Grace." Men. Vivian stood in the village square on a Friday afternoon, surrounded by 40 people who looked at her like she was either a savior or a lunatic. Possibly both. She'd spent the past week gathering evidence, copies of forged deeds, testimony from displaced families, a paper trail that led straight back to the Coastal Development Association and the nobles who owned it. Then she'd done something that Mrs. Greaves had warned her against. She'd called a public meeting. The turnout was better than expected. Farmers, fishermen, shopkeepers, a few of the braver tenants who still had their land but knew they'd be next. They stood in the cold January wind, faces hard and suspicious, waiting to see if this London girl actually had anything worth saying. Vivian had dressed simply. No silk, no jewelry, nothing that would mark her as separate from them. But she could feel the distance anyway. She was Lord Ashford's daughter. She'd grown up in ballrooms and estate houses. These people had grown up fighting for survival. She cleared her throat. Most of you know me, some of you don't. My name is Vivian Ashford, and I've been living at Greaves Estate for 3 months. In that time, I've watched 4 families lose their land to the Coastal Development Association. I've seen the documents they're using, and I'm here to tell you that what's happening isn't legal. It's theft. Silence. A few people shifted their weight. Someone coughed. Thomas Hewitt stood near the back, his face carved from the same granite as the cliffs. No offense, miss, but what are you going to do about it? You're one woman with no money and no connections. They're lords with solicitors and magistrates in their pockets. I have something better than connections, Vivian said. I have proof. Forged signatures, falsified dates, witness testimony, everything we need to bring charges. Charges? A woman near the front, Mary Fletcher, who'd lost her farm 2 months ago, laughed bitterly. Against who? Lord Pemberton? Lord Hastings? They'll laugh us out of court. Not if we take it to London. Not if we make enough noise that they can't ignore us. Vivian pulled out the stack of documents she'd compiled. I'm going to the London papers. I'm going to show them exactly what's happening here. And I'm going to make sure everyone in England knows that nobles are stealing land from families who've worked it for generations. More silence. Then Thomas spoke again, his voice rough. Why? Why do you care? You're not from here. This isn't your fight. Vivian met his eyes. She thought about her father selling her future to secure an alliance. She thought about Adrian, who'd probably never questioned his right to control everything around him. She thought about every room she'd ever walked into where the rules were written by people with power and enforced on everyone without it. Because I'm tired of watching people with everything take from people with nothing, she said quietly. And because if we don't fight back, they'll keep taking until there's nothing left. Thomas studied her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. All right. What do you need? Statements. Signed testimony from everyone who's been affected. Copies of the original agreements if you have them. Anything that proves these sales weren't voluntary. She paused. And you need to understand, once we do this, there's no going back. They'll come after all of us. Mary Fletcher stepped forward. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. They already took my home. What else can they do to me? One by one, the others stepped forward too. Not all of them. Some stayed at the edges, too afraid or too defeated. But enough. Enough to make a stand. Vivian felt something unfold in her chest, something that felt dangerously close to hope. She didn't see the man watching from the window of the Anchor Inn across the square. Didn't see Adrian Blackthorne standing in the shadows, his face unreadable, his hands gripping the windowsill hard enough to hurt. She didn't know he'd arrived in Ashcroft-on-Sea 3 hours ago. Didn't know he'd been watching her since the meeting started. Didn't know that the moment she'd stepped into that square and started making noise, she'd sealed both their fates. Seat. Adrian waited until after sunset. He'd watched the meeting disperse, watched Vivian speak with individual families, watched her write down names and promises she had no way to keep. She was so focused on the work that she never looked up at the inn window, never saw him standing there. When she finally left the square, heading back toward Greaves Estate, Adrian followed at a distance. The road wound along the cliffs, narrow and treacherous in the dark. The sea crashed against the rocks below, loud enough to swallow sound. Vivian walked fast, her cloak whipping in the wind, one hand holding a lantern that barely cut through the fog. Adrian kept to the shadows. He told himself he was just ensuring she made it back safely, that he'd turn around once she was inside the estate gates, that this wasn't obsession, wasn't desperation, wasn't the behavior of a man who'd lost control of everything that mattered. Then Vivian stopped walking. She set the lantern down and turned to face the darkness behind her. I know you're there. Adrian froze. You've been following me since the village. Her voice was steady, calm. If you're planning to rob me, I should warn you. I have nothing worth stealing. If you're planning something worse, you should know I scream very loudly and Mrs. Greaves keeps a shotgun by her bed. Adrian stepped forward into the lantern light. Vivian's face went white. Adrian. He said nothing, just stood there, watching her process his presence. She'd changed in 3 months. Her skin was darker from the sun, her hands rougher, her entire bearing different somehow. Less polished. More solid. What are you doing here? She demanded. I could ask you the same question. His voice came out rougher than intended. What the hell do you think you're doing, standing in a public square and declaring war on 5 noble families? I'm exposing criminals. You're painting a target on your back. He moved closer. The wind was brutal up here, cold enough to sting. Do you have any idea how dangerous these men are? What they'll do to protect their investments? Vivian's eyes narrowed. How do you know about any of this? Adrian realized his mistake too late. He'd shown his hand, revealed that he'd been paying attention, keeping track, watching from the shadows like some kind of... You've been having me followed, Vivian said flatly. Haven't you? I've been ensuring your safety. Without my knowledge, without my permission. She took a step back. For how long? Adrian didn't answer. For how long, Adrian? Since you left London. The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Vivian stared at him like she was seeing something she'd never expected to find. Not anger. Something closer to horror. 3 months, she whispered. You've been watching me for 3 months. You walked away from everything. The words came out harder than he meant them to. From your family, from security, you disappeared into the countryside with no protection, no resources. What was I supposed to do? Let me go. Her voice cracked. That's what you were supposed to do, except that I didn't want to marry you and move on with your life. I did move on. Then why are you here? Adrian couldn't answer that, couldn't explain that he'd spent 3 months trying to convince himself he didn't care, trying to focus on business and politics and all the things that used to matter. Couldn't admit that he'd read every report Graves brought him, memorized every detail of her new life, and felt something tear open in his chest every time he thought about her building a future that didn't include him. He couldn't say any of that, so he said what he could. You're in danger, real danger. The men you're threatening, they don't play by rules. They don't care about honor or justice or public opinion. They care about money, and you're standing between them and millions of pounds in property value. He took another step closer. Come back to London. Let me handle this. Vivian laughed. It was a terrible sound. Sharp and broken. Let you handle it. Control it. Make it go away so I don't have to see the ugly parts. She shook her head. That's why I left, Adrian, because you think everything and everyone can be managed if you just apply enough pressure in the right places. That's how the world works. That's how your world works. And I don't want to live in it. The words hit harder than they should have. Adrian felt something cold settle in his chest, something that felt like the moment before drowning. So you'd rather die fighting a battle you can't win? I'd rather die fighting than live in a cage. Vivian picked up her lantern. Go back to London. Forget you saw me, and for God's sake, call off whoever you have watching me. She turned to leave. Adrian grabbed her arm. It wasn't rough. He barely touched her. But Vivian froze like he'd struck her, and when she looked up at him, her eyes were full of something he couldn't name. Let go, she said quietly. He should have. Every rational part of his mind was screaming at him to let go, to walk away, to let her make her own choices and live with the consequences. But rationality had stopped working somewhere around the 3rd month of reading reports about her life and imagining what it would be like if she just came back. Just gave him another chance. I can protect you, he said. I can make sure nothing happens to you. You don't have to do this alone. I don't want your protection. Her voice was shaking now. I want you to leave me alone. I can't. The confession came out raw, unplanned. Adrian saw Vivian's expression shift, saw understanding dawn in her eyes, and hated himself for revealing something he'd barely admitted to himself. Why not? She whispered. Because I think about you every morning when I wake up and every night before I sleep. Because watching you walk away was the worst thing I've ever experienced. And I'm terrified that if I let you face this alone, I'll lose you permanently. Because somewhere in the past 6 months, you became the only thing in my entire life that feels real. He couldn't say any of that. So he said nothing. Vivian pulled her arm free. You need to let me go, Adrian. Really, let me go. Not watch from the shadows, not send reports, not show up when I'm trying to build something that's mine. Her voice broke. You need to accept that I don't belong to you. I know that. Do you? Adrian opened his mouth, closed it. He thought about his father, about 8 generations of Blackthorns who'd learned to control everything through force of will and strategic cruelty. He thought about the empire he'd built, the power he wielded, the way everyone he'd ever known treated him like something between a weapon and a god. And then he thought about Vivian standing in that ballroom, pulling her hand away from his, and realizing that all the power in the world couldn't make someone stay if they didn't want to. "No," he said finally, honestly. "I don't think I do." Vivian's eyes filled with something that might have been pity, or sadness, or both. "Then we have nothing else to say to each other." She walked away. This time Adrian didn't follow. He stood on that cliff road until her lantern disappeared into the fog, until the cold had seeped through his coat and into his bones, until he couldn't feel his hands anymore. Then he walked back to the inn and sent word to his contacts in London. If Vivian was going to fight this battle, he couldn't stop her, but he could make damn sure she had the ammunition she needed. And if that meant destroying 5 noble families who'd been useful political allies, then that's what he'd do. Because somewhere between the engagement and the rejection and the 3 months of watching her from the shadows, Adrian Blackthorn had crossed a line he hadn't even known existed. He'd become the kind of man who would burn down his entire world just to keep one woman safe, even if she never knew he was the one holding the torch. The assassination attempt came on a Wednesday. Vivian was working in Mrs. Greaves's study, organizing testimony and copying documents, when she heard glass shatter in the drawing room. Then a crash. Then silence that felt wrong, too heavy, like the air before a storm. She stood slowly. The house was supposed to be empty. Mrs. Greaves had gone to visit her solicitor in town, and the housekeeper had the afternoon off. Vivian grabbed the letter opener from the desk. It was small, decorative, probably useless as an actual weapon, but it was sharp enough to make her feel slightly less defenseless. She moved toward the doorway, her heart hammering so hard it hurt. The hallway was dark. No lamps lit. No sound except her own breathing and the distant crash of waves against the cliffs. She reached the drawing room doorway and stopped. The window was broken, glass scattered across the floor. The curtains moved in the wind, and standing in the center of the room, holding a crowbar, was a man she'd never seen before. He was young, maybe 25, with the build of someone who worked with his hands. Not noble, not educated, just desperate enough to take money for something that might involve violence. "You're Lady Vivian," he said. Not a question. She tightened her grip on the letter opener. "Who are you?" "Doesn't matter." He shifted his weight. The crowbar gleamed dully in the gray afternoon light. "I've got a message. Stop making noise about the land sales. Stop gathering testimony. Stop talking to magistrates and newspapers. Just stop." "Or what?" "Or accidents start happening." His voice was flat, rehearsed. "First to you, then to the families helping you, then to that old woman you're living with, nothing personal, just business." Vivian's hands went numb. She thought about Mary Fletcher, about Thomas Hewitt, about all the people who'd trusted her with their stories, about Mrs. Greaves, who'd given her a place to stay when she had nowhere else to go. "Who sent you?" she demanded. "Doesn't matter." "It does to me." The man's jaw tightened. "Look, I don't want to hurt you. I'm just supposed to scare you enough that you back off. So consider yourself scared, and we can both walk away from this." Vivian knew she should agree, should nod and promise to stop and wait until he left before doing exactly what she'd been doing anyway. That was the smart move, the safe move. Instead, she heard herself say, "No." The man blinked. "What?" "No, I'm not stopping. Tell whoever sent you that I'm taking this to London anyway. Tell them I have evidence and witnesses and I'm not afraid of them." Her voice was shaking but steady. "And tell them that threatening me just proves I'm right about everything." The man stared at her like she'd lost her mind. "Lady, you're not hearing me. This isn't a negotiation." "Then what are you waiting for?" The words came out harder than she felt. Braver. But Vivian was tired of being afraid. Tired of watching powerful men destroy lives because they knew no one would fight back. Tired of the voice in her head that sounded like her father, like Adrian, like every man who'd ever told her that safety was more important than doing what was right. The man's grip on this crowbar tightened. For a horrible moment, Vivian thought he might actually use it. Thought she'd pushed too hard, called a bluff that wasn't a bluff. Then the front door slammed open. Adrian Blackthorne stood in the entryway, his coat still dusty from the road, his face carved from ice and fury. He took one look at the broken window, at Vivian holding the letter opener, at the man with the crowbar, and went completely still. "Get out," Adrian said quietly. The man turned. His face went white when he saw who was standing there. "Your Grace, I said get out!" The crowbar clattered to the floor. The man ran, literally ran, stumbling over the broken glass in his desperation to reach the door. His footsteps receded down the hallway, then the front door slammed again, and the house fell silent. Vivian stood frozen, her entire body shaking with adrenaline she couldn't release. The letter opener slipped from her fingers and landed on the carpet with a soft thud. Adrian crossed the room in 3 strides and grabbed her shoulders. "Are you hurt?" She couldn't speak, could barely breathe. Her vision was blurring at the edges, her lungs refusing to work properly. "Vivian, look at me. Are you hurt?" She shook her head. Not hurt, just terrified, just realizing how close she'd come to something very bad happening. Adrian's hands moved from her shoulders to her face, tilting her head up so she had to meet his eyes. They were dark, wild, nothing like the controlled mask he usually wore. "What the hell were you thinking? Antagonizing him like that?" I don't know." Her voice came out broken. I couldn't let him think he'd won." "He had a crowbar, Vivian. He could have killed you. But he didn't." She was starting to shake harder now, the full weight of what had almost happened crashing down. "How did you know to come?" Adrian's jaw tightened. "I've had men watching the estate since I got back to London. One of them saw someone climbing through the window and sent word immediately." He paused. "I rode here fast enough that I probably killed my horse." Vivian stared at him, at the fear still naked in his face, at the way his hands were trembling against her skin. "You've still been watching me?" "Yes." "Even after I told you to stop?" "Yes." No apology, no excuse, just raw admission. Vivian should have been angry, should have pushed him away, told him to leave, maintained the boundaries she'd tried so hard to establish. But standing in that room with broken glass at her feet and adrenaline still screaming through her veins, all she could think was that if Adrian hadn't been watching, if he hadn't had someone guarding the house, she'd be alone right now, possibly hurt, possibly worse. "You can't do this," she whispered. "You can't keep inserting yourself into my life every time something goes wrong. Watch me." "Adrian." "No." His voice was hard now, desperate. "You want to fight these men? Fine. But you're not doing it alone. Not anymore. Because they just proved they're willing to use violence. And I will not stand by and let you get hurt trying to be brave. I don't need you to protect me. I know. You've made that very clear." His hands dropped from her face. "But I'm going to anyway. Because if something happens to you while I'm sitting in London pretending I don't care, I won't survive it. Do you understand? I won't." The confession hung between them, raw and terrible. Vivian saw the cracks in Adrian's armor, saw the man beneath the title and the power and the reputation, and realized with sudden, horrible clarity that this was worse than anything she'd imagined. He wasn't trying to control her. He was drowning. And he'd decided she was the only thing worth holding on to. "This isn't healthy," she said quietly. "What you're feeling, it's not love, Adrian. It's obsession." "I know." His voice was hoarse. "I know exactly what it is. And I can't stop it." He turned and walked toward the door, his footsteps echoing through the empty house. But before he left, he stopped and looked back at her one final time. His eyes were dark, haunted, full of something that looked like a man staring into an abyss he couldn't climb out of. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a promise that made ice run down Vivian's spine. "I'm not leaving Ashcroft. I'm moving into the Anchor Inn permanently. And if anyone else tries to threaten you, I won't just scare them off. I'll destroy everything they've ever cared about." Then he was gone, and Vivian was left standing alone in a room full of broken glass, realizing that she'd become the center of something she couldn't control, a storm-gathering force, a man unraveling at the edges, a collision that would end with someone destroyed. And she had no idea how to stop what she'd started when she walked away from him in that ballroom 6 months ago. Adrian spent the next 3 days turning Ashcroft-on-Sea into a fortress. He didn't ask permission. He simply moved men into position. former soldiers, investigators, people who owed him favors or feared him enough to comply without question. By the end of the first day, every approach to Greaves' estate was being watched. By the second, he'd identified everyone in the village who'd taken money from the Coastal Development Association. By the third, he had enough evidence to destroy Lord Pemberton and his allies 3 times over. He worked from a room at the Anchor Inn that smelled like salt and old wood, spreading documents across a table that had probably seen 100 years of sailors and fishermen, maps of the coastline, property deeds, witness statements, everything Vivian had gathered, plus everything his own people had uncovered. The pattern was worse than he'd initially thought. The fraud wasn't just about stealing land, it was about consolidating the entire coast into the hands of 5 families who planned to sell it to a railway company for 10 times what they'd paid. Thousands of people would be displaced, an entire way of life erased. All for profit margins that would barely register in the fortunes of men who already had more money than they could spend in 3 lifetimes. It was brilliant, really. Ruthless and efficient, and exactly the kind of scheme Adrian might have admired if it hadn't involved threatening Vivian. He was reviewing a forged deed when Graves entered, his expression carefully neutral in the way that meant bad news. "Your Grace, Lord Hastings is here to see you." Adrian looked up. Hastings was the local magistrate, 70 years old, mostly retired, the kind of man who'd spent his career trying to do good work in a system designed to protect the powerful. "Send him in." Hastings entered a moment later, moving slowly, his cane tapping against the floorboards. He looked tired. No. Exhausted, like a man who'd been fighting a losing battle for too long. "Your Grace." Hastings bowed slightly. "Thank you for seeing me." "Sit." Adrian gestured to the chair across from him. "You look like you're about to collapse." Hastings lowered himself carefully into the seat. "I'm told you've taken an interest in the land situation here." "I have." "May I ask why?" Adrian considered lying, considered offering some strategic justification about protecting his own investments or maintaining social stability. But looking at Hastings' face, at the exhaustion and frustration and bitter resignation there, he decided on truth. "Someone I care about is trying to expose the fraud. The people behind it sent a man to threaten her with violence. That made it personal." Hastings nodded slowly. "Lady Vivian, I've met her. She came to my office last week with evidence of forged signatures." He paused. "I told her I couldn't help." "Why not?" "Because I've tried." The old man's voice cracked. "For 2 years, I've been filing complaints, requesting investigations, sending reports to London. Nothing happens. The families involved have too much influence. They have friends in Parliament, connections to the Crown. Every time I think I've built a case strong enough to prosecute, it disappears. Witnesses recant, documents vanish, and I'm left looking like a fool who doesn't understand how the world works." Adrian heard the defeat in those words, recognized it. He'd seen it before in men who'd fought systems designed to crush them, who discovered that integrity was no match for concentrated power. "So you gave up," Adrian said quietly. "I survived." Hastings met his eyes. "There's a difference. If I'd kept pushing, they would have removed me from office and replaced me with someone who'd approve everything without question. At least this way I can slow them down, make them work for it, save a few families here and there." He leaned forward. "But Lady Vivian, she doesn't understand compromise. She thinks exposure and public outrage will be enough. And she's wrong." "Maybe?" "Not maybe. Certainly." Hastings' voice hardened. "These men don't care about public opinion. They care about profit, and they've already proven they're willing to use violence to protect their interests. That man who broke into Greaves' estate? He won't be the last. Next time, they'll send someone who won't run when you show up." Adrian's hands tightened on the edge of the table. "Then I'll make sure I'm there to stop them." "You can't be everywhere. You can't protect her every moment." The old man's expression softened. "I know what you're trying to do. But you're one man, Your Grace. Even with all your power, you can't fight 5 noble families and win without destroying yourself in the process. Watch me." Hastings studied him for a long moment. Then he sighed and stood, leaning heavily on his cane. "I hope you succeed, truly. Because if you don't, Lady Vivian will pay the price. And so will everyone who's helped her." After he left, Adrian sat alone in the silence, staring at the documents spread before him. He thought about his father's voice, cold and certain. Power is the only thing that matters. Sentiment is weakness. A blackthorn does not bend. But his father had never met Vivian Ashford, had never felt what it was like to watch someone walk away and realize that all the power in the world couldn't make them stay, had never understood that some things were worth bending for, worth breaking for, if the alternative was losing them permanently. Adrian picked up a pen and began writing letters. To allies in Parliament, to journalists in London, to everyone who owed him favors or feared his influence. If Vivian was determined to make noise, then he'd make sure it was loud enough to be heard across England. And if that meant burning every bridge he'd ever built, then so be it. Cookies. Vivian received the summons on a Thursday morning. It came as a formal letter, delivered by a writer wearing Lord Pemberton's colors. The seal was unbroken, the paper expensive, the handwriting elegant. Everything about it screamed legitimacy and power. Lady Vivian Ashford is cordially invited to attend a gathering at Pemberton Manor this Saturday evening to discuss the recent concerns regarding property transfers in the Ashcroft area. Light refreshments will be served. Formal attire requested. Vivian read it 3 times, her stomach tightening with each pass. She found Mrs. Greaves in the kitchen, kneading bread dough with arthritic hands. "They want to meet with me," Vivian said, holding up the letter. Mrs. Greaves didn't stop kneading. "Of course they do. You've made enough noise that ignoring you isn't working anymore. Now they'll try negotiation." "Should I go?" "Absolutely not." The old woman's hands worked the dough harder. "It's a trap. They'll try to buy you off, threaten you into silence, or worse. Nothing good happens to young women who accept invitations from desperate men with everything to lose." Vivian set the letter on the table. "But if I don't go, it looks like I'm afraid of them." "You should be afraid of them." "I am." Vivian's voice was steady despite the fear coiling in her gut. "But I'm more afraid of what happens if I back down now. All those families who trusted me with their stories. What message does it send if I refuse to face the men responsible?" Mrs. Greaves finally stopped kneading. She turned to look at Vivian, her eyes sharp and knowing. "You're not doing this for them. You're doing it to prove something to yourself." "Maybe." Vivian thought about that ballroom in London, about pulling her hand away from Adrian's, about 3 months of rebuilding herself into someone who didn't need permission or protection. "Is that wrong?" "No, but it might get you killed." The old woman wiped her hands on her apron. "If you're determined to go, at least tell the Duke. Let him send men with you." "Adrian doesn't get a say in my decisions." "He'll come anyway. The man's been camped out at the Anchor Inn for 3 days, running his own investigation and scaring half the village with how intense he looks." Mrs. Greaves smiled grimly. "You might have walked away from him, girl, but he clearly hasn't walked away from you." Vivian knew that, had felt it every time she left the estate and saw one of Adrian's men watching from a distance. Had heard about his late-night meetings with Hastings, his letters to London, his systematic dismantling of the Coastal Development Association's network. Part of her wanted to confront him again, to tell him to stop, to leave, to let her handle this alone. But another part, a part she didn't want to acknowledge, was grateful he was there. Because facing Pemberton alone was terrifying, and knowing Adrian was watching from the shadows made it slightly less so. She hated that, hated needing anyone, even tangentially. But survival and pride rarely occupied the same space, and right now survival felt more important. "I'll tell him," Vivian said finally, "but I'm going regardless of what he says." Mrs. Greaves shook her head. "Stubborn child, you and the Duke deserve each other, Sharak." Adrian received the news an hour later. He was meeting with one of his investigators when Graves entered and handed him a note. Adrian unfolded it and read Vivian's neat handwriting. "I've been invited to Pemberton Manor on Saturday evening. I'm going. Don't try to stop me. But if you insist on continuing your surveillance, at least make sure your men are competent enough to intervene if something goes wrong. V." Adrian crumpled the note in his fist. Around him, the room went silent. His investigator, a former soldier named Crawford, who'd worked for the Blackthorn family for 15 years, cleared his throat carefully. "Your Grace?" "She's walking into a trap." Adrian's voice was flat. "And she knows it." "Then we stop her." "We can't." He threw the crumpled note across the room. "She's right. If I try to prevent her from going, it undermines everything she's been fighting for. But if I let her go alone—" He didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Everyone in the room understood what men like Pemberton were capable of when cornered. Crawford spoke carefully. We could send men inside, servants, people who can watch without being obvious. Pemberton will have security. He'll check credentials. Adrian paced to the window and stared out at the gray sea. But he won't refuse an announcement that I'm attending as well. Silence. Then Graves spoke, his voice measured. Your Grace, if you attend, it changes the entire dynamic. Pemberton will see it as a declaration of open hostility. Good. Adrian turns to face them. Because that's exactly what it is. Send word that the Duke of Blackthorn accepts Lord Pemberton's invitation and will be escorting Lady Vivian to the gathering. Make it formal, public, impossible to refuse. Crawford nodded slowly. And if they try to threaten her anyway? Adrian's expression went cold. Then I'll make sure they regret it for whatever time they have left. Saturday arrived wrapped in fog and the smell of approaching rain. Vivian dressed in the only formal gown she still owned, dark green silk that had been expensive once but was now slightly worn at the hem. She pinned her hair up carefully, applied minimal cosmetics, and stared at her reflection in the mirror. She looked older than she had 6 months ago. Harder. The softness that came from never having to fight for anything had been scraped away, replaced by something sharper and more dangerous. She thought about the girl who'd stood in that London ballroom and walked away from a duke, about how terrified she'd been beneath the calm exterior, how certain that she was making a terrible mistake. Looking at herself now, she wondered if that girl would recognize what she'd become. The knock on her door came precisely at 6. Vivian opened it, expecting Mrs. Greaves, ready with last-minute warnings and sharp advice. Instead, she found Adrian. He was dressed in full formal attire, black jacket, silk cravat, boots polished to a mirror shine. His hair was perfectly styled. His face was composed. Everything about him screamed power and control except his eyes, which were dark and wild and barely contained. "What are you doing here?" Vivian demanded. "Escorting you." His voice was perfectly calm. "I sent word to Pemberton that I'd be attending. He couldn't refuse without creating a scandal." "I didn't ask you to do that." "I know." He held out his arm. "But I'm doing it anyway. You can argue with me in the carriage, or you can accept that this is happening, and we can focus on surviving the next 3 hours." Vivian wanted to refuse, wanted to tell him to leave, to stop inserting himself into her life, to respect the boundaries she'd tried so desperately to maintain. But looking at his face, at the fear beneath the control, she realized something important. This wasn't about control. Not anymore. This was about a man who'd convinced himself that if he wasn't there to protect her, she'd disappear. And arguing about it now wouldn't change anything except make them both late. She took his arm. They rode to Pemberton Manor in tense silence, the carriage rattling over rough roads while rain began to fall in sheets. Adrian sat across from her, his posture perfect, his hands resting calmly on his knees. But Vivian could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw kept tightening. "You don't have to do this," she said finally. "Yes, I do." "Why? If this goes badly, it could destroy your political alliances. Pemberton isn't alone. He has friends, connections. Turning against him openly means making enemies you can't afford." Adrian looked at her then, really looked, and the expression on his face was something between resignation and desperation. "I don't care about political alliances anymore. I care about making sure you walk out of that manor alive." The words hung between them, raw and honest. Vivian felt something crack in her chest, something she'd been holding on to for months. "Adrian, don't." His voice was rough. "Don't tell me this is unhealthy or wrong or obsessive. I know what it is. But I can't stop it, and I've stopped trying to pretend otherwise. So let me do this. Let me be there. And when it's over, you can go back to hating me. I don't hate you." "You should." The carriage pulled up to Pemberton Manor before Vivian could respond. Adrian climbed out first and offered his hand. She took it, his fingers closing around hers with desperate strength, and together they walked into the lion's den. What? Pemberton Manor was everything Vivian expected, ostentatious wealth trying desperately to mask old decay. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers, the guests wore their finest clothes, and somewhere a string quartet played music that sounded expensive and soulless. Lord Pemberton met them at the entrance, his smile wide and false. "Your Grace, Lady Vivian, how delightful that you could join us." Adrian's voice was ice. "Lord Pemberton, quite the gathering you've assembled." "Just a small group of concerned parties. We thought it might be productive to discuss recent misunderstandings in a civilized manner." Pemberton's eyes flicked to Vivian. "Lady Vivian, I'm so glad you accepted our invitation. There's been quite a lot of unfortunate talk lately. We'd like to set the record straight." "The record is already straight," Vivian said calmly. "You and your associates have been stealing land through fraud and coercion. I have documented proof." The smile didn't falter. "Bold claims, but claims require evidence that will stand up in court. And I think you'll find that courts can be selective about what they choose to believe." Adrian stepped forward, not threatening, not aggressive, just a subtle shift in position that put him slightly between Vivian and Pemberton. "Are you threatening her, Pemberton?" "Of course not, Your Grace. Merely stating facts." Pemberton gestured toward the ballroom. "Please, join us. There are several people who'd like to speak with Lady Vivian." They entered together. The room fell quiet in sections, conversations dying as heads turned to watch. Vivian recognized some of the faces. Lord Hastings looking old and defeated in the corner, Lady Worthington from London society watching with predatory interest. Several other nobles whose names she didn't know, but whose expressions told her everything about their loyalties. And there, near the center of the room, stood 4 other men, lords all of them, the remaining members of the conspiracy. Adrian's hand tightened on her arm. "Stay close to me." One of the men approached, Lord Blackwell, maybe 40 years old, with the kind of face that spoke of generations of inbreeding and inherited cruelty. "Your Grace, we weren't expecting you to attend personally. I'm full of surprises." Adrian's voice could have frozen the sea. "Shall we discuss why we're actually here?" Blackwell's smile was thin. "Direct. I appreciate that." "Very well." He turned to Vivian. "Lady Vivian, you've been making quite a nuisance of yourself. Spreading rumors, gathering testimony, generally creating problems for legitimate business interests." "Legitimate?" Vivian's voice rose. "You're stealing land from people who've worked it for generations. You're forging deeds, bribing officials." "We're investing in progress," Blackwell interrupted smoothly. "The railway is coming whether you like it or not. These people can't afford to maintain their properties. We're offering them a way out before they lose everything anyway." "By threatening their children? By burning their homes? Unfortunate incidents, not our responsibility." He paused. "But they could stop. All of this unpleasantness could stop. If you'd be willing to see reason." Adrian's voice was deadly quiet. "What are you offering? A reasonable settlement?" Pemberton had moved to join them, flanked by the other conspirators. "We're prepared to offer Lady Vivian a substantial sum, let's say £10,000, in exchange for her agreement to cease her investigation and public commentary. Additionally, we'd be willing to renegotiate the terms for several of the affected families. Not all of them, naturally, but some. A gesture of goodwill." Vivian stared at him. "You're trying to buy me off." "We're trying to find a mutually beneficial solution." Pemberton's voice was honey smooth. "You get financial independence. The families you care about get better terms. Everyone walks away satisfied. Except the families you don't renegotiate with, except the people you've already displaced." Vivian felt rage building in her chest, hot and terrible. "You're asking me to take money to stop fighting for justice." "We're asking you to be practical," Blackwell said. "You can't win this fight. We have resources, connections, legal protection you can't match. The best you can hope for is to save a few people and walk away with something for your trouble. Or you can refuse and we'll crush everyone involved, including you." The room had gone completely silent. Every eye was on them, watching this confrontation unfold with the kind of fascinated horror usually reserved for public executions. Adrian's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "She refuses." Pemberton's expression hardened. "Your Grace, this doesn't concern you." "It does now." Adrian moved to stand fully in front of Vivian. "Lady Vivian is under my protection. Any threat against her is a threat against me. So let me make this very clear. If you or anyone associated with you approaches her again, threatens her, or attempts to harm her in any way, I will personally ensure that every bank you owe money to calls in your debts, every business partner you have finds better opportunities elsewhere, and every political ally you've cultivated decides you're too toxic to support. Do you understand? Or Blackwell's face flushed with anger. You can't threaten us like this. We have rights, connections. I'm the Duke of Blackthorn. Adrian's voice dropped to something soft and lethal. I've destroyed better men than you for lesser offenses. Test me if you'd like. See what happens. The silence stretched. Then Pemberton laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. Interesting. The great Duke Adrian Blackthorn, brought low by sentiment. Your father would be ashamed. My father is dead. I'm not. Not yet. Pemberton's smile widened. But interfering with our business could change that. Accidents happen, Your Grace. Even to dukes. Adrian went completely still. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Did you just threaten my life? I stated a fact. The coast is dangerous, cliffs are unstable, people fall. Pemberton's eyes gleamed. It would be tragic if something happened to you while you were here defending Lady Vivian's honor, almost as tragic as if something happened to her after you left. Vivian felt Adrian's entire body tense beside her, felt the violence coiling in him like a spring wound too tight. She grabbed his arm before he could move. Don't. That's what they want. But Adrian wasn't listening anymore. She could see it in his face, the cold, calculated fury of a man who'd been raised to view threats as challenges and challenges as things to be crushed without mercy. He took a step toward Pemberton. That's when Lord Hastings spoke from the corner, his voice shaking. Your Grace, Lady Vivian, perhaps you should leave. Now. Adrian didn't turn. Why? Because this isn't a negotiation anymore, it's a trap. Hastings stood, leaning heavily on his cane. And you've walked right into it. The doors to the ballroom slammed shut. The click of locks echoed through the sudden silence. Around the perimeter of the room, men appeared, not servants, but hired muscle, the kind who did violent work for money and didn't ask questions. Pemberton's smile turned vicious. Did you really think we'd let you walk out of here after threatening us publicly? You've become a problem, Your Grace. Both of you have. And problems need to be solved. Vivian's blood went cold. She looked around the room, 20 guests, all watching with expressions ranging from fear to excitement, none of them moving to help. 10 hired men blocking the exits, and 5 nobles who'd decided that murder was preferable to exposure. Adrian's hand found hers and squeezed once, hard. When I move, run for the east window. It leads to the gardens. Crawford and my men are positioned there. What about you? I'll be right behind you. He was lying. Vivian knew he was lying. Knew that Adrian was calculating odds and deciding that the best way to ensure her escape was to create a distraction using himself as bait. No, she whispered. We go together or not at all. Vivian, Pemberton's voice cut through their whispered argument. How touching. But neither of you is leaving. We'll stage it carefully. A tragic accident, the Duke and his former fiancée caught in a storm on the cliffs, both bodies found in the morning. Very sad. No evidence of foul play. Adrian's voice was deadly calm. You'll never get away with this. We already have. Pemberton gestured to the men along the walls. No witnesses who'll talk. No evidence that can't be explained away. Just another unfortunate tragedy. He paused. I did try to warn you, Your Grace. I came to you months ago, asked for your help ensuring Lady Vivian stayed quiet. You refused. You could have avoided all of this if you'd just been reasonable. And that's when Vivian understood. The sick, horrible truth of it. Pemberton hadn't come to Adrian for help intimidating her. He'd come to test where Adrian's loyalties lay, to see if the Duke could be bought or threatened or manipulated. And when Adrian had refused, when he'd made it clear that Vivian was under his protection, Pemberton had decided that both of them needed to disappear. The man standing in front of them wasn't just defending his fraud scheme. He was eliminating witnesses who could destroy him, and he'd lured them here with an invitation that looked like negotiation, but was really execution. Adrian had walked them both into this because he'd been so focused on protecting her that he'd missed the larger trap. And now they were locked in a room with killers, surrounded by nobles, who decided their fortunes were worth more than 2 lives, with no way out except through violence. Vivian looked at Adrian's face and saw the exact moment he realized the same thing. Saw the cold calculation give way to something that looked like raw fear. Not fear of dying, fear of failing to save her. And she knew with absolute certainty that whatever happened next would change everything. That some lines, once crossed, destroyed the person who'd been standing on the other side. That Adrian Blackthorne was about to become something he'd spent 34 years carefully avoiding, a man with nothing left to lose. Adrian moved first, not toward the doors, not toward the windows, toward Pemberton, closing the distance between them in 3 strides before anyone could react. His hand caught the Lord's throat, fingers digging in hard enough to bruise, hard enough to cut off air. Pemberton's eyes went wide with shock and the beginning of real fear. The hired men along the walls surged forward. Adrian didn't let go. "Call them off," he said quietly. His voice was calm, conversational. The tone you'd use discussing weather or wine selection. "Call them off, or I crush your windpipe right here in front of everyone." Pemberton made a choking sound. His hands clawed at Adrian's wrist. Around them, the ballroom erupted into chaos, guests scrambling away from the violence, hired men drawing weapons, Blackwell shouting orders that got lost in the noise. Vivienne stood frozen, watching Adrian's face. There was no rage there, no emotion at all, just cold, focused intent. This was what a man looked like when he'd calculated the cost of every possible action and decided that some prices were worth paying. "Your Grace," Blackwell's voice cut through the chaos. "Let him go, now, or we'll be forced to it." Adrian's free hand shot out and grabbed a candelabra from the nearest table. He brought it down on Blackwell's skull with enough force that the metal rang like a bell. Blackwell dropped, blood streaming from his scalp, and suddenly the entire room understood that the Duke of Blackthorne wasn't bluffing. "Anyone else want to threaten me?" Adrian's voice was still calm, still conversational. His hand tightened on Pemberton's throat. "No? Then here's what's going to happen. You're going to unlock those doors. You're going to let Lady Vivian walk out of here unharmed, and then you and I are going to have a very different conversation about what happens to men who think they can murder nobles without consequences." Pemberton's face was turning purple. His lips moved, trying to form words that wouldn't come. One of the hired men, bigger than the others, scarred, stepped forward with a club raised. Vivian didn't think. She grabbed a chair and swung it with all her strength, catching the man across the shoulders. The chair shattered. The man stumbled. And suddenly she was holding a broken chair leg like a weapon, her heart hammering so hard she could barely breathe. The man turned toward her, rage twisting his features. Adrian saw it happening and made a choice that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago. He let go of Pemberton and threw himself between Vivian and the advancing threat. The club came down. Adrian caught it with his forearm, bone meeting wood with a crack that echoed through the ballroom. His other hand drove forward, fingers rigid, catching the man's throat in a strike that sent him choking to his knees. Behind them, Pemberton was gasping for air, one hand on his throat, his eyes full of murder. "Kill them," he wheezed. "Kill them both. Now." The hired men moved as one. Adrian grabbed Vivian's hand and ran. They crashed through a side door, not locked, probably meant for servants, and found themselves in a narrow hallway lit by a single lamp. Behind them, footsteps thundered, shouts, the sound of furniture being overturned. "This way." Adrian pulled her left toward a staircase that descended into darkness. His breath was ragged. Blood dripped from where the club had split the skin on his forearm. "There should be a servant's entrance to the gardens. If we can reach Crawford, Adrian, your arm doesn't matter." He was moving fast, faster than should have been possible with an injury like that. Adrenaline or desperation or both? "Just keep moving." They hit the stairs at a dead run. Vivian's skirts tangled around her legs, nearly sending her tumbling. Adrian's hand on her elbow kept her upright, kept her moving. The staircase was steep, narrow, designed for staff who needed to move quickly between floors without being seen by guests. At the bottom, they found a locked door. Adrian didn't hesitate. He drove his shoulder into it once, twice, and on the third impact the wood splintered. They burst through into what looked like a kitchen, cold ovens, hanging pots, the smell of old grease and copper. A scullery maid screamed and dropped a plate. "Where's the exit?" Adrian demanded. The girl pointed with a shaking hand toward another door. They ran, leaving her staring after them with wide, terrified eyes. The exit led to a mudroom, then to the gardens beyond. Rain was falling in sheets now, turning the ground to mud, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Adrian didn't slow. He pulled Vivian toward the tree line, toward where his men should have been waiting. But the gardens were empty. No Crawford. No guards. No one. Adrian stopped so abruptly that Vivian crashed into his back. He was staring at something in the darkness, his entire body gone rigid. She followed his gaze and felt her stomach drop. Crawford was there. He was just dead. The body lay half hidden in the bushes, throat cut, eyes staring at nothing. Around him 3 more bodies, Adrian's other men, all killed with brutal efficiency. No gunshots, no struggle, just quick professional violence. They knew. Adrian's voice was hollow. They knew I'd bring men. They killed them before we even arrived. Vivian's mind was racing, trying to process what this meant. Pemberton hadn't just planned to trap them in the ballroom. He'd planned for every contingency, had positioned his own killers in the gardens, had eliminated Adrian's backup before the confrontation even began. This wasn't impulse. This was premeditated murder, executed with military precision. Behind them, voices echoed from the house. Closer now. Organized. Adrian grabbed her hand again. Run! They ran into the storm, away from the lights of Pemberton Manor, away from the voices and the death and the trap that had closed around them. The rain was so heavy it felt like drowning. Vivian's dress was soaked through in seconds, the fabric clinging to her legs, making every step harder. Her lungs burned, her legs screamed, but she kept moving because stopping meant dying, and dying meant Pemberton won. The ground sloped upward, turning from manicured gardens to wild heath. They were climbing toward the cliffs. Vivian realized with sick certainty where they were heading, toward the edge of the property, where the land dropped away into the sea 200 feet below. Adrian must have realized it too because he tried to change direction, pulling her toward what looked like a path leading back toward the road. But the voices behind them were too close now. Shouts, the snap of branches, the focused pursuit of men who knew this terrain and weren't slowed by formal clothing or injuries. They broke through a line of trees and suddenly there was nowhere left to run. The cliff edge stretched before them, invisible in the darkness but unmistakable. Vivian could hear the waves crashing against rocks far below, could feel the wind trying to pull her forward. Behind them, the trees rustled as their pursuers closed in. Adrian positioned himself between Vivian and the approaching threat. His arm was still bleeding, rain washing the blood down his hand in rivulets. His breath came in harsh gasps, but his stance was solid, balanced, ready. When they get close enough, he said quietly, I'm going to rush them. While they're focused on me, you run. Follow the cliff edge north. There's a fishing village about 2 miles that way. Find help. I'm not leaving you. Vivian, no. Her voice was sharp, final. You don't get to sacrifice yourself so I can escape. That's not how this works. That's exactly how this works. He didn't turn to look at her, eyes fixed on the tree line. One of us needs to survive to expose what happened here, to make sure those families get justice. And I'm the expendable one. You're not. The hired men emerged from the trees, 6 of them, moving in formation, weapons drawn. Pemberton came with them, one hand still on his throat, his face twisted with rage and something else. Triumph. He'd backed them into a corner with no escape, and he knew it. End of the line, Pemberton said. His voice was hoarse, damaged by Adrian's grip. I'll give you one final choice, Your Grace. Jump together and make it quick, or we can do this slowly. Your decision. Adrian said nothing, just shifted his weight, calculating angles and distances, trying to find an opening that didn't exist. Pemberton smiled. Nothing to say? No final threats? No promises to destroy me? He moved closer, staying behind his men, coward to the end. You should have stayed in London, should have let Lady Vivian fight her little crusade alone, but you couldn't, could you? Because you're weak, sentimental. Exactly what your father always feared you'd become. Something flickered across Adrian's face then, not anger, something colder. He'd spent his entire life being compared to his father, being measured against a standard that demanded emotional emptiness as proof of strength. And here, at the edge of death, someone was using that same judgment as mockery. Adrian laughed. It was a terrible sound, sharp and bitter and free. You want to know the difference between my father and me? He would have let you get away with this. would have calculated that fighting back would cost more than it was worth, would have chosen power over everything else. He glanced back at Vivian, and his eyes were clear, certain. I choose her, every time, even if it costs me everything. The confession hung in the storm-torn air. Vivian felt something crack open in her chest, something she'd been holding closed since that ballroom in London. Because this wasn't obsession, wasn't control. This was a man who'd spent his entire life learning to be untouchable, and he was choosing to be destroyed instead. Pemberton's smile widened. How touching! Kill them! The men moved forward. Adrian met them halfway. What happened next was violence stripped of pretense or civilization. Adrian fought the way men fight when survival is the only goal, dirty, brutal, using everything available. He caught the first man's wrist and twisted until something snapped, drove his knee into another's gut hard enough to lift him off his feet, used the cliff edge itself as a weapon, forcing attackers to choose between engaging him or falling. But there were 6 of them, and he was injured and exhausted and fighting in formal clothing on muddy ground. Within seconds, they had him pinned. A club came down on his shoulder. Another caught his ribs. Adrian went to his knees, blood mixing with rain, still trying to fight. Vivian screamed and charged forward with the broken chair leg she'd somehow held onto through the entire escape. She swung wildly, connecting with someone's face, feeling bone give way under the impact. Hands grabbed her from behind. She fought, kicked, bit, did everything she could to break free. Enough! Pemberton's voice cut through the chaos. Hold them both. They were dragged back to the cliff edge, held in place by men whose grip left bruises. Adrian was barely conscious, head hanging, blood dripping from a cut above his eye. Vivian struggled against the hands holding her, knowing it was useless, knowing they'd lost. Pemberton approached slowly, savoring the moment. I want you to understand something before you die. This isn't personal. This is business. You threatened our profits, our futures. This is simply the consequence of poor choices. He gestured toward the cliff edge. When they find your bodies tomorrow, it will be tragic. A lover's quarrel, perhaps, or an accident during a storm. Either way, no evidence, no witnesses, just 2 more people who got in the way of progress. The man holding Adrian shifted his grip, preparing to throw him over. Adrian's eyes found Vivian's across the distance. He mouthed something that looked like, I'm sorry. Then everything exploded into light and sound. The storm that had been building all night finally broke directly overhead. Lightning struck so close that Vivian felt the electricity in her teeth, heard the thunder as a physical force that knocked everyone off balance. In that moment of confusion, Adrian moved. He drove his head backward into his captor's face, felt the nose break, twisted free. His hands closed around the nearest weapon, the same club that had struck him, and he swung it in a wide arc that caught 2 men across the knees. They went down screaming. Vivian used the distraction to drive her elbow into the solar plexus of the man holding her. His grip loosened just enough. She pulled free, slipped in the mud, caught herself, looked up to see Adrian advancing on Pemberton with methodical, terrifying focus. Pemberton scrambled backward, terror replacing his earlier confidence. Wait, Your Grace, we can negotiate. You had your chance to negotiate. Adrian's voice was dead calm. You chose murder instead. He grabbed Pemberton by the front of his jacket and dragged him toward the cliff edge. Not to throw him over. To make him look. To make him understand what he'd been so willing to do to others. Look down, Adrian commanded. Pemberton was sobbing now, all pretense of control gone. Please. Look. Down. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the drop. 200 feet of nothing, ending in rocks and churning water. A death sentence. Adrian held Pemberton there for a long moment, letting the fear sink in, letting him feel what it was like to be powerless. Then he pulled him back from the edge and threw him to the ground. You don't get to die quickly, Adrian said. You get to stand trial. You get to watch everything you built crumble. And you get to know that the only reason you're still breathing is because the woman you tried to kill is a better person than you'll ever be. He turned to Vivian. The remaining hired men had fled when the lightning struck, melting back into the storm. It was just the 3 of them now. Adrian, Vivian, and Pemberton, sobbing in the mud. Are you hurt? Adrian's voice had shifted, become gentle again. Vivian shook her head, not trusting her voice. She was shaking so hard her teeth chattered, adrenaline draining away and leaving her hollow. Adrian moved toward her, each step careful like he was approaching something fragile. When he reached her, he didn't grab or control or demand. He just stood there, close enough to touch, waiting. Vivian looked at his face, at the blood and rain and exhaustion, at eyes that had been dead when she first met him and were somehow alive now, even in the midst of this nightmare. She thought about the man who'd stood in that ballroom 6 months ago, who'd watched her walk away without saying a word. And she thought about the man standing in front of her now, who'd just chosen destruction over control. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you risk everything for this? For me?" Adrian's answer was simple, honest, devastating. Because a world where you don't exist isn't a world worth protecting. The words hung between them like a confession, like a wound opened. Vivian felt tears mixing with rain on her face and couldn't tell which was which anymore. Behind them, Pemberton was still sobbing. Around them, the storm raged, and somewhere in the distance, Vivian heard voices, real voices this time, calling out, searching. Adrian's backup arriving too late, or villagers responding to the lightning, or something else entirely. Adrian heard it too. Relief flickered across his face for just a moment before the mask came back up. He turned toward the voices, toward rescue, toward whatever came next. But Vivian caught his hand before he could move away. "Adrian, when this is over, don't." His voice was rough. "Don't make promises you might regret when you're not terrified and exhausted. Whatever you feel right now is real," she finished. "And it's been real for longer than I wanted to admit." She saw the hope flash across his face, saw him try to contain it, control it, protect himself from disappointment. But it was there, visible, human. The voices were getting closer. Multiple people now calling their names. Lanterns flickering in the darkness. Adrian looked at Vivian one more time, memorizing her face like he thought he might never see it again. "We should—" That's when the gunshot rang out. Pemberton had found a pistol, probably dropped by one of the fled hired men. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely aim, but he was pointing it at them with wild, desperate hatred. "If I'm going to lose everything," he screamed, "then so are you." He fired. The world slowed down in the way it does when everything is about to change forever. Vivian saw the flash from the barrel, saw Adrian's eyes widen with understanding, saw him move. He hit her with his full weight, driving them both to the ground. The bullet passed through the space where she'd been standing, so close she felt the wind of it. They landed hard, breath knocked from both their lungs. For a moment, everything was silent except the rain and the waves and Pemberton's ragged breathing as he realized his shot had missed. Then voices erupted from the tree line, men appearing with lanterns and weapons. Magistrate Hastings at the front, looking older than death but moving with purpose. More people behind him, villagers. Some of the families Vivian had been fighting for. A small army of witnesses who'd followed the sounds of violence to this clifftop. Pemberton stared at them all, gun still shaking in his hand. Vivian could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. The moment he realized he had no moves left, no escape, no way to spin this into anything but what it was. He turned the gun toward his own head. Adrian rolled off Vivian and lunged, closing the distance impossibly fast despite his injuries. His hand caught Pemberton's wrist, forcing the barrel up and away. The gun fired into the air. Then Adrian wrenched it free and threw it into the darkness beyond the cliff edge. "No," he said flatly. "You don't get that escape either." Pemberton collapsed, all fight gone, and Adrian stood over him breathing hard while rain washed blood from his face in pink streams. Around them, witnesses stared in shock at the scene they'd stumbled into. A nobleman covered in blood, a woman in a ruined dress, another lord sobbing on the ground, and bodies somewhere back in the gardens. Hastings moved forward slowly, his old eyes taking in everything. "Your Grace, Lady Vivian, what happened here?" Adrian's voice was steady despite everything. "Attempted murder. Lord Pemberton and his associates tried to kill us to cover up their fraud scheme. My men are dead in the gardens. The conspirators fled when the storm hit." He paused. "There are 4 bodies. There will be documentation in Pemberton Manor linking all of them to the land fraud." Hastings looked at Pemberton, who was still sobbing, then back at Adrian. "This will cause a scandal that reaches the crown." "I know. Your political career may not survive it." "I don't care." Adrian glanced at Vivian, something raw and honest in his expression. Some things matter more than politics. Hastings studied them both for a long moment. Then he nodded and gestured to the men with him. "Secure Lord Pemberton. Search the manor. And someone fetch a physician. The Duke is bleeding through his jacket." As people moved to follow orders, Hastings leaned close to Adrian and spoke quietly enough that only Vivian could hear. "Your father would have handled this differently. Would have found a way to cover it up, protect the reputation of the nobility, made deals instead of exposing everything." "I know," Adrian said. "That's why I'm not him." Hastings smiled then, thin and knowing. "No, you're not. You're something better." The old magistrate moved away to supervise, leaving Adrian and Vivian standing together at the cliff edge. The rain was finally letting up, turning from downpour to drizzle. In the distance, the first hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the eastern sky. Vivian looked at Adrian's profile, the sharp lines of his face, the blood drying in his hair, the way he stood despite obvious pain because sitting down would mean admitting weakness. She thought about the man she'd rejected 6 months ago, about the cold, controlled Duke who'd watched her walk away without protest. That man was gone, burned away by something neither of them had expected or planned for. And the person standing in his place was someone Vivian wasn't sure she understood yet, someone capable of both terrible violence and terrible vulnerability, someone who'd just proven he'd rather die than let her come to harm. "Adrian," she said quietly. He turned to face her. In the growing dawn light, his eyes were the color of storm clouds breaking, exhausted, wary, hopeful in a way that looked painful. "When we get back," Vivian continued, "when all of this is documented and Pemberton is in custody and the families have their justice, we need to talk, really talk, about what this means, about what we mean. All right?" His voice was careful, controlled, protecting himself from hope. "And if you decide you still want nothing to do with me after everything that's happened, then I'll tell you." She moved closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. "But Adrian, I don't think that's what I'm going to decide." She saw the hope crack through his control then, saw the mask slip entirely, revealing something vulnerable and desperate underneath. He opened his mouth to speak. That's when his eyes rolled back and his legs gave out. Vivian caught him as he fell, his weight nearly taking them both down. Blood was soaking through his jacket in places she hadn't noticed before. Not just his arm, but his side where the club had caught him, his shoulder where something had torn. He'd been bleeding this entire time, fighting through it on pure adrenaline, and now that the immediate danger was past, his body was shutting down. She screamed for the physician as Adrian's head lolled against her shoulder, his breathing shallow and uneven. Around them, people rushed to help, but all Vivian could think was that she'd finally admitted she wanted him alive and in her life, and the universe was taking that moment to remind her that wanting and having were separated by fate's cruelest timing. She held him as they lowered him to the ground, as the physician cut away his jacket to reveal injuries that made even hardened villagers wince, as Adrian's eyes fluttered open one more time and found hers with desperate focus. "Stay," he mouthed, barely conscious. "Just stay." And Vivian realized with absolute certainty that she was never leaving again, that whatever had been broken between them in that London ballroom had been reforged into something stronger here on this clifftop, sealed in blood and rain and shared survival. But first, Adrian had to survive the next few hours. And as the physician worked with grim efficiency, as dawn broke fully over the coast, Vivian held Adrian's hand and prayed to forces she didn't believe in that the universe wouldn't take him from her now, not when they'd finally found each other in the wreckage. Adrian woke to pain that felt like fire spreading through every nerve in his body. The room was unfamiliar. White walls, the smell of carbolic and laudanum, morning light filtering through curtains that were too thin to be from Blackthorn Hall. He tried to sit up and immediately regretted it, a sharp agony lancing through his ribs that made his vision blur. A hand pressed gently against his shoulder, easing him back down. "Don't." Vivian's voice, tired, strained. "The physician said you cracked 3 ribs and lost enough blood that you should be dead. Moving is a bad idea." Adrian turned his head slowly, the only movement that didn't send fresh waves of pain through his body. Vivian sat in a chair beside the bed, still wearing the ruined green dress from the night before. Or was it the night before? He had no idea how much time had passed. Her hair was falling out of its pins, her face exhausted, but her eyes were clear and fixed on him with an intensity that made his chest tighten in ways that had nothing to do with broken bones. How long? His voice came out rough, barely above a whisper. 18 hours. You've been in and out of consciousness. She reached for a glass of water on the bedside table and held it to his lips. Small sips. The physician said your body needs to recover slowly. Adrian drank, the water feeling like salvation against his parched throat. When he was done, Vivian set the glass aside and returned to her vigil, hands folded in her lap like she was afraid if she stopped watching him, he might disappear. Pemberton? He asked. In custody. Magistrate Hastings arrested him and the two remaining conspirators who didn't flee. The other two, Blackwell and Lord Somerset, died from their injuries before help arrived. Her voice was flat, reciting facts to avoid feeling them. They found your men in the gardens, all four. And they found documentation in Pemberton's study that proves everything, the fraud, the coercion, the bribes, everything we needed. Adrian closed his eyes. 4 good men dead. Crawford, who'd served the Blackthorne family for 15 years. The others whose names he'd known, whose families he'd met. Dead because he'd brought them into a situation he'd underestimated, because he'd been so focused on protecting Vivian that he'd failed to see the full scope of the trap. It's not your fault, Vivian said quietly, reading his expression. They knew the risks. They chose to be there. I chose to bring them into danger. Adrian's hands tightened on the bedsheet, the only outlet for rage and grief he could manage without tearing his injuries open further. I should have, what? Seen the future? Known that Pemberton would go to such extremes? She leaned forward, her face closer to his. Adrian, you can't control everything. You never could. That's what I've been trying to tell you since the beginning. He looked at her then, really looked, and saw the truth written in the exhaustion around her eyes. She'd been sitting here for 18 hours, watching him bleed and breathe and cling to life, not because she had to, not because anyone forced her, but because she'd chosen to stay. The realization hit harder than any club. Vivian had chosen him. Finally, completely. In the worst possible moment, covered in blood and rain and facing death, she'd chosen to stay by his side. And Adrian had no idea what to do with that knowledge except feel it tear him apart and rebuild him simultaneously. I don't know how to do this, he admitted quietly. The words felt like confessing to a crime. I spent 34 years learning to control everything around me, to never show weakness, to treat emotions like liabilities. And then you walked into my life and destroyed every principle I'd built myself on. Vivian's expression softened. Is that a complaint? No. He tried to smile and felt something pull in his face where he'd been hit. It's a warning. I don't know how to be the man you deserve. I don't know how to stop trying to control and protect and manage every situation. It's who I was raised to be. Then unlearn it. Her voice was gentle but firm. The man who threw himself in front of a bullet for me. That's who you actually are when you stop trying to be what your father wanted. That's the person I want. Not the Duke of Blackthorne with his perfectly controlled reputation. Just Adrian. The name sounded strange coming from her. He'd been your Grace or Duke or Blackthorne for so long that his actual name felt like something from another life. Something softer, more human. Just Adrian, he repeated slowly, testing how it felt. I'm not sure he exists without the title. Then we'll find out together. She reached for his hand, her fingers lacing through his with careful pressure that avoided his injuries. Because I'm not going anywhere. Not this time. The promise hung in the air between them, weighted with everything that had happened and everything that might come. Adrian wanted to believe it, wanted to trust that this moment, this connection, was real and lasting and not just trauma bonding in the aftermath of violence. But trust was something he'd spent his entire life learning not to give. And unlearning that kind of conditioning wasn't going to happen in a single conversation, no matter how much he wanted it to. A knock on the door interrupted before he could respond. Magistrate Hastings entered, moving slowly, his cane tapping against the floorboards. He looked even older than he had 2 days ago, as if the events at Pemberton Manor had aged him a decade overnight. Your Grace, Lady Vivian, I hope I'm not intruding. Not at all. Vivian stood, offering Hastings her chair. The old man waved her off and remained standing. I wanted to update you both on the situation before word reaches London. Hastings' expression was grim. Lord Pemberton has confessed to everything. The fraud, the intimidation, the attempted murder. He's trying to negotiate clemency by providing testimony against the railway company that was funding the scheme. Adrian's voice was sharp despite his exhaustion. No clemency. He murdered my men. He tried to kill us. He destroyed families for profit. I agree. Hastings nodded. But the decision isn't mine alone. This will go to trial in London, and there will be pressure to minimize the scandal. 5 noble families involved, connections to the crown, millions of pounds in disputed property. The people who benefit from keeping this quiet will try very hard to do so. Let them try. Adrian shifted slightly, gritting his teeth against the pain. I have documentation, witness testimony, and I have enough political capital left to make sure this becomes impossible to bury. Hastings studied him with those old, knowing eyes. It will cost you. Your allies will abandon you for turning on other nobles. Your reputation as someone who protects the aristocracy will be destroyed. You'll be seen as a traitor to your class. Good. The word came out flat, final. Because my class protected monsters and called it business. If being a traitor to that is what it takes, then that's what I'll be. Vivian's hand tightened on his, and Adrian felt something shift in his chest. The old version of himself, the one his father had built through discipline and cruelty, would have found a way to use this situation for advantage, would have negotiated, compromised, protected the system while appearing to reform it. But that version of Adrian Blackthorne had died on a clifftop in the rain, and what remained was someone he didn't fully recognize yet, someone capable of choosing justice over strategy, someone who discovered that the things worth protecting weren't always the things that protected you back. Hastings smiled then, thin but genuine. Your father would be rolling in his grave. I hope so, Adrian said quietly. I sincerely hope so. Yebag. The trial took 3 months to organize. Adrian spent that time recovering at Greaves' estate, against every instinct that told him to return to London and manage the situation personally. But his injuries were severe enough that the physician threatened him with permanent damage if he didn't rest, and Vivian had made it clear that she'd tie him to the bed if necessary to keep him from leaving. So he stayed. And in staying, he learned things about himself he'd never had the opportunity to discover. He learned that he could wake up without immediately calculating the day's strategic objectives, that he could sit in silence without it feeling like wasted time, that Vivian's presence beside him, reading while he dozed, working on correspondence while he stared out the window, was something close to peace. He also learned that letting go of control was the most terrifying thing he'd ever attempted. Every day brought news from London, reports of the investigation spreading, names being named, families scrambling to distance themselves from the scandal, and every day, Adrian's hands would shake with the need to intervene, to manage, to control the narrative before it spiraled beyond his ability to contain. Vivian would find him those mornings, standing at the window with his jaw clenched and his shoulders rigid, and she'd say the same thing every time. Let it burn. Let the corruption be exposed. Let the guilty face consequences. Let the system that had protected them crack and splinter under the weight of its own rot. It went against every instinct Adrian had ever developed. But he was trying to become someone new, someone better, and that meant learning to trust that justice could happen without his hand on the scales. The hardest part wasn't the injuries or the loss of control, or even the knowledge that his political career was effectively over. The hardest part was the nights when he'd wake from nightmares of that clifftop, of Pemberton's gun, of watching Vivian die in 100 different variations that his traumatized mind constructed with vicious creativity. Those nights, Vivian would wake with him, would sit beside him in the darkness and talk about nothing, the weather, the estate, the families they'd helped, until his breathing steadied and the panic receded. She never told him it was going to be all right, never offered false comfort or empty reassurance. She just stayed, present and solid and real. And slowly, painfully, Adrian began to believe that maybe survival didn't require being untouchable. Maybe it required exactly the opposite, being willing to be wounded, to need someone, to admit that strength sometimes looked like falling apart and trusting someone else to help you stand back up. It was the hardest lesson he'd ever learned. It was also the only one that mattered. The trial began on a gray morning in March, When London was still shaking off winter and the streets smelled like coal smoke and approaching rain, Adrian and Vivian traveled to the city together, arriving the night before to stay at Blackthorn Hall. The house felt different somehow, colder, emptier, like a mausoleum built for a version of himself that no longer existed. They stood in the study where Adrian had spent so many hours building his empire, and he felt like a stranger in his own home. "You don't have to go tomorrow," Vivian said quietly. She was standing by the window, looking out at the London skyline. "You've already given your deposition. The magistrate has all the evidence. You could stay here and let the system work." Adrian moved to stand beside her. "Could you?" She smiled, thin and knowing. "No." "Then neither can I." He paused. Those families deserve to see that someone with power actually cared enough to show up. And Pemberton deserves to see both of us alive and unbroken when they sentence him. The next morning, they walked into the Old Bailey together. The courtroom was packed. Nobles, journalists, common citizens who'd been affected by the fraud scheme. Every eye turned to watch as the Duke of Blackthorn and Lady Vivian Ashford took their seats in the gallery. Adrian heard the whispers, saw the stares, felt the weight of judgment from people who'd spent months debating whether he was a hero or a traitor. He kept his spine straight and his expression calm, falling back on years of training in how to present an unshakable facade. Then Vivian's hand found his under the cover of the bench between them, her fingers lacing through his, and Adrian stopped caring what anyone else thought. The trial lasted 6 days. 6 days of testimony from displaced families, from magistrates who'd been bribed, from investigators who'd been threatened. 6 days of documents being presented, signatures being compared, the systematic dismantling of 5 noble families who'd thought their titles would protect them from consequences. Pemberton sat in the dock looking older than his years, his throat still bruised from where Adrian had nearly crushed it. When he was called to testify, his voice was a rasp, and his story was a masterpiece of deflection and blame shifting. He'd been pressured by the railway company. He'd been misled by his associates. He'd never intended for violence to occur. It was a performance. And it might have worked if Adrian hadn't had Crawford's widow in the gallery, watching with eyes that held all the grief and rage of someone who'd lost everything to these men's greed. When it was Adrian's turn to testify, he told the truth. All of it. The attempted bribery, the assault at Greaves' estate, the murder of his men, the confrontation on the cliff. He described Pemberton's words, his actions, the calculated cruelty of someone who'd decided that profit was worth more than human life. And when the prosecutor asked why Adrian had risked his reputation to pursue this case so aggressively, he looked directly at Pemberton and answered with words that would be quoted in newspapers for weeks. Because some things are worth more than reputation. Some things are worth burning everything you've built to protect. And if we don't hold powerful men accountable when they use that power to destroy the powerless, then we deserve the broken system we get. The courtroom erupted. The judge called for order, and Adrian returned to his seat beside Vivian, feeling lighter than he had in months. On the 6th day, the jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous on all counts. Guilty. Pemberton's face went white. The other defendants began shouting about appeals, about injustice, about how this would never have happened if Adrian Blackthorn hadn't betrayed his own class. The judge sentenced them without ceremony, 20 years hard labor for Pemberton, 15 for the others, all property seized to compensate the families they'd defrauded. As guards led them from the courtroom, Pemberton looked directly at Adrian. His eyes were full of hatred and something else. Fear. The kind of fear that comes from realizing that the rules you thought were absolute could be broken if someone powerful enough decided they no longer applied. Adrian stared back without flinching, without gloating, just witnessing the consequences of choices made. Then it was over. The crowd began to disperse, journalists rushed to file their stories, and Adrian and Vivian walked out of the Old Bailey into grey London afternoon light, surrounded by strangers who didn't know whether to congratulate them or condemn them. They walked in silence through the streets, away from the crowds, toward the Thames where they could breathe without being watched. The river was high and grey, churning with the tide. Gulls wheeled overhead, their cries sharp and lonely. Vivian spoke first. "What happens now?" Adrian considered the question. He'd lost most of his political allies. His reputation in aristocratic circles was destroyed. Several families had already cut ties with Blackthorn business interests, and more would follow once they saw which way the wind was blowing. By every metric that had mattered to him 6 months ago, he'd lost. And yet standing here beside Vivian, watching the river flow past, he felt something that might have been freedom. I don't know, he admitted. I've spent my entire life knowing exactly what came next, what moves to make, what alliances to build, how to position myself for maximum advantage. He paused. Now I have no idea. And it's terrifying, and it's the most honest I've felt in years. Vivian smiled. Then let's figure it out together. No plans, no strategy, just two people deciding what kind of life they actually want to build. Adrian turned to face her fully. The gray light made her eyes look darker, deeper. She'd changed too over these months. The sheltered nobleman's daughter had been replaced by someone harder, sharper, more certain of herself. Someone who'd faced death and chosen to fight back. Someone who'd looked at a duke and seen past the title to the broken man underneath. I want you to know something, Adrian said carefully. I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of what you gave me. Not your love, though I hope to earn that eventually, but your faith. Your belief that I could be better than what I was raised to be. Vivian's expression softened. Adrian, you already are better. You proved it when you chose justice over preservation. When you testified knowing it would cost you everything. When you stopped trying to control me and started trusting me instead. I still want to protect you. That instinct hasn't gone away. I know. But there's a difference between protecting someone and controlling them. You figured out which one actually matters. She moved closer, close enough that he could see the silver flecks in her eyes. So yes, I love you. And no, you don't have to earn it. You already did, the moment you admitted you were scared and broken and didn't have all the answers. The words hit Adrian like a physical force. Love. She'd said it so simply, so certainly, like it was the most obvious truth in the world. And maybe it was. Maybe love was what happened when you stopped pretending to be invincible and let someone see you at your worst and they chose to stay anyway. He kissed her then. Not a claim or a possession, but a question asked and answered. Her hands came up to frame his face, careful of the still healing injuries, and for a moment the entire world narrowed to just this. Her lips, her breath, the impossible reality that she was here and real and his. When they finally broke apart, Adrian rested his forehead against hers and spoke words he'd never imagined saying. Marry me. Vivian pulled back slightly, her expression caught between surprise and something that might have been amusement. Is that a request or a command? A request. A desperate one. He took her hands in his, feeling the calluses she'd developed from 3 months of actual work at Greaves' estate. I know I'm a terrible bet right now. Politically ruined, financially uncertain, still learning how to be a functional human being, but I know with absolute certainty that I want to spend whatever time I have left learning how to be better. And I want to do it with you. Vivian was quiet for a long moment, and Adrian felt his heart hammering against his cracked ribs. She could say no. She had every right to say no, to tell him it was too soon, too complicated, too much risk for someone who'd already sacrificed so much. Instead, she smiled. Yes, on one condition. Anything. We don't have the wedding in London. We do it at Ashcroft-on-Sea with the families we fought for. Small, real. Nothing like the performance we were supposed to have before. Adrian felt something loosen in his chest. I can live with that. Good. She kissed him again, softer this time. Because I'm not marrying the Duke of Blackthorn. I'm marrying Adrian, and he doesn't need grand gestures or political theater. He just needs to show up and be honest. That's. They married on a summer morning when the sea was calm and the sky was the kind of blue that only existed in memory in coastal villages. The ceremony took place in the garden of Greaves' estate, surrounded by wildflowers and the families they'd helped save. No aristocrats. No political allies. Just Thomas Hewitt and Mary Fletcher and the others who'd trusted Vivian with their stories and trusted Adrian enough to let him into their lives despite his title. Mrs. Greaves presided, having somehow acquired the authority to perform marriages through connections Adrian didn't question. She was 72 and sharp as broken glass, and she told them both that if they made each other miserable, she'd haunt them personally. Adrian wore a simple black suit. Vivian wore a dress she'd sewn herself, cream-colored linen that caught the sea breeze. There were no family members present. Lord Ashford had disowned Vivian completely when the trial ended, And Adrian's family consisted entirely of dead ancestors he was trying very hard not to emulate. But standing there surrounded by people who knew exactly who they were and chose to celebrate anyway, Adrian felt more connected than he ever had at Blackthorn Hall. The vows were simple, traditional words about love and loyalty and choosing each other every day. When it was Adrian's turn to speak, he looked at Vivian and said the truest thing he knew. I promise to keep trying to be better than I was yesterday. I promise to trust you even when control feels safer, and I promise that loving you will always matter more than protecting my pride. Vivian's eyes shimmered with tears she refused to let fall. When it was her turn, her voice was steady. I promise to see you. Not the title, not the reputation, just you. I promise to call you out when you're being impossible. And I promise that choosing you was the best decision I ever made. And I'll keep making it every day for the rest of my life. They exchanged rings, simple gold bands, nothing ostentatious, and Mrs. Greaves pronounced them married with a smile that suggested she'd known this ending before they'd figured it out themselves. The celebration afterward was nothing like the grand affair Adrian's first engagement had promised. There was food cooked by local families, music played by fishermen with more enthusiasm than skill, dancing in the garden while the sun set over the sea. Adrian danced with his wife. His wife, the word still felt surreal, and felt the weight of 34 years of conditioning continue to crack and fall away. He wasn't the Duke of Blackthorn here. He was just Adrian, just a man who'd been given a second chance he didn't deserve, and was determined not to waste. Later, after the guest had left and the stars had come out, Adrian and Vivian walked down to the cliffs. Not the same cliffs where they'd nearly died, those would always carry shadows, but a different stretch of coast where the rocks formed natural seats and the view stretched to the horizon. They sat together in silence, Vivian's head on Adrian's shoulder, his arm around her waist. The sea moved below them, eternal and indifferent. Somewhere in the darkness, gulls called to each other. The air smelled like salt and summer flowers. Do you regret it? Vivian asked quietly. Everything you lost? Adrian considered this question honestly. He'd lost his political career, lost business partnerships worth hundreds of thousands of pounds, lost the respect of his peers and the social position his family had built over 8 generations. But he'd gained something he'd never had before. The ability to look at himself in a mirror and recognize the person staring back. No, he said finally. I regret what I was before. I regret the people I hurt by being so focused on control that I forgot to be human. I regret not walking away from my father's expectations sooner. He paused. But I don't regret burning it all down if that's what it took to become someone worthy of you. Vivian turned to look at him, her face barely visible in the starlight. You keep saying that, worthy of me, like I'm some kind of prize you had to earn. Aren't you? No. Her voice was firm. I'm just a person who made choices, who got lucky that you made different choices. We saved each other, Adrian, not one person rescuing another, both of us choosing to be better than we were. The truth of that settled into Adrian's bones. He'd spent so long thinking in hierarchies and power dynamics, in relationships defined by who controlled whom. But this, what he had with Vivian, existed outside those structures entirely. It was partnership, mutual respect. Two people who'd seen the absolute worst of each other and decided that what they'd found was worth fighting for. What do we do now? Adrian asked. Rebuild the estate? Try to salvage what's left of the Blackthorn businesses? We could. Vivian was quiet for a moment. Or we could do something different. Use what resources you have left to actually help people instead of accumulating more power. Work with families like the ones here. Fight systems that protect the powerful at everyone else's expense. Adrian felt something shift in his chest. The old version of himself would have rejected that immediately. Too idealistic, too impractical, too much risk for too little strategic gain. But the person he was now, the person Vivian had helped him become, recognized the truth in her words. Power without purpose was just accumulation for its own sake, and he'd spent enough of his life accumulating. Maybe it was time to actually use what he had for something that mattered. All right, he said. We'll figure it out together. Together, Vivian agreed. She kissed him softly, her hand resting over his heart. Just promise me one thing. Anything. Promise me you'll stop trying to be perfect. Stop trying to have all the answers. Just be Adrian, messy and uncertain and human. Adrian laughed, the sound rusty but genuine. I can do that, mostly because I don't have any other choice anymore. Good. Vivian settled back against him, and they sat together watching the stars wheel overhead. Adrian thought about his father, about 8 generations of Blackthorns who'd built their legacy on dominance and control, about the man he'd been raised to become, cold, calculating, untouchable, about the path he'd been on before a woman in a ballroom had looked at him with clear eyes and decided he wasn't worth staying for. She'd been right. The man he was then hadn't been worth it. But maybe, just maybe, the man he was becoming was different. Maybe survival didn't require being a fortress. Maybe it required exactly what terrified him most: vulnerability, trust, the willingness to be broken and rebuilt. He was still learning, still fighting instincts that told him to control and dominate and protect himself above all else. Still waking up some mornings and forgetting that he didn't have to be the Duke of Blackthorn anymore, that he could just be Adrian. But he was trying. And every day that Vivian woke up beside him and chose to stay was proof that trying was enough. The sea moved below them, patient and eternal. Above them, the stars burned cold and distant. And between those two infinities, Adrian Blackthorn, no longer quite a duke, not yet quite whole, but finally, impossibly himself, sat with his wife and watched the night unfold. There would be challenges ahead. Financial struggles as they rebuilt on different principles. Social isolation from the world they'd rejected. Moments when the old instincts would resurface and he'd have to choose again between control and trust. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, there was just this: starlight, sea air, and the steady rhythm of Vivian's breathing against his chest. The simplest things. The only things that had ever really mattered. And Adrian, who'd spent 34 years learning to conquer and dominate and never surrender, finally understood what it meant to win. It meant letting go. It meant falling apart. It meant trusting someone enough to help you stand back up. It meant choosing love over power every single time, even when everything you'd been taught screamed that power was the only thing worth having. He'd lost an empire, and in losing it, he'd found something worth more than any kingdom. A life that was actually his, built on foundations that couldn't be taken away by politics or scandal or the judgment of people who'd never understood what mattered. Vivian stirred against him, half asleep, murmuring something about going back to the house. Adrian lifted her carefully, mindful of his still healing ribs, and carried her through the summer darkness toward home, not Blackthorn Hall with its cold grandeur and 8 generations of ghosts. Home. This small estate by the sea where the only legacy that mattered was the one they'd build together. And as Adrian crossed the threshold carrying his wife, he felt the last chains of his father's expectations finally break and fall away. He was free, broken, uncertain, learning how to be human one painful day at a time, but free. And that was worth everything he'd lost and everything he'd yet to become. The door closed behind them, shutting out the night. Inside, lamplight glowed warm and golden. Somewhere a clock ticked steadily onward. And Adrian Blackthorn, who'd once believed that control was the only thing keeping him from drowning, finally learned to breathe. Years later, when people asked about the Duke who'd destroyed his own reputation to pursue justice, the stories would vary wildly. Some said he'd gone mad. That obsession with a woman had broken something fundamental in him. That he'd thrown away everything that mattered for sentiment and paid the price. Others said he'd been a hero. That he'd proven that even the powerful could choose principle over preservation. That his testimony had changed how England viewed the relationship between nobles and the people they were supposed to serve. Both versions had elements of truth. Both missed the actual story. Because Adrian Blackthorn hadn't been destroyed or redeemed. He'd simply been transformed by the oldest force in human history. Someone seeing past every defense he'd ever built and choosing to stay anyway. He'd lost an empire, gained a life, and discovered that the second was infinitely more valuable than the first. And when he died decades later, not in Blackthorn Hall, but in that small estate by the sea, surrounded by children and grandchildren who knew him as Adrian, not your Grace, his last words were simple. She stayed. It was enough. It was everything. And in the end, that was the only story that mattered.